Okay, I'd like to start so that we can wrap this up in a timely fashion. I realize people have busy schedules today. My name is Tony Daly. I'm an economist with the Communications Workers of America, of which the News Guild is a part. Today, the News Guild-CWA presents a panel of newsroom employees who have stories to share about the internal operations of their news outlets. It is important for investors to have an alternative source of information about the companies in which they invest. We will be talking about things that Mike Reed, chairman and CEO of Gannett, does not broach in either his press releases or in his investor calls. The overarching narrative here is that Mike Reed has damaged the long-term viability of our company's product, news. He has cut newsrooms to levels rivaling that great vulture of news, Alden Global Capital. Mike Reed and his policies are destroying the long-term viability of Gannett. The 5 reporters you're about to hear come from 5 different Gannett papers in 5 different states. They will discuss the impact of Mike Reed's policies on their news outlets. If there is one thread that ties together these stories, it is that the cuts have real consequences, for shareholders, for stakeholders, employees and communities alike. I should also add that it has consequences for shareholders who've lost 70% of their value since the merger. We hope you have read the letter from News Guild President John Schlois to Gannett shareholders. That letter grew out of conversations within the Gannett caucus, a group of over 50 bargaining units. It is a powerful indictment of Chairman Mike Reed and how his prioritizing debt over all else has led to cuts in staff and cuts in local stories. The bottom line is that Gannett has regionalized its local papers, increasingly using regional hubs and wire services to fill the pages of his papers. We believe he needs to go. These testimonies give you an insight into the breakdown of operations at Gannett news outlets. Whether it is news stories no longer covered and communities poorly served, or such extreme staffing cuts the company runs legal liability, or poor efforts at diversity when diversity means having bilingual, culturally sensitive staff in newsrooms. These outlets have problems that can be traced directly to decisions Mike Reed has initiated. These talented reporters will tell their stories. We will hear from our 5 reporters in this order of sequence. Justin Murphy, reporter for the Democrat and Chronicle in Rochester, New York. Antigone Barton, investigative reporter for the Palm Beach Post in Palm Beach, Florida. Eliana Perez, reporter for the Desert Sun in Palm Springs, California. Kayla Dwyer, reporter for the Indianapolis Star in Indianapolis, Indiana. Diane Smith, reporter for the Record Courier in Kent, Ohio. News Guild President John Schlois will then offer a perspective on the news industry in general and the manner in which Gannett has failed its stakeholders. We are unified in believing that Mike Reed needs to go. To you, Justin.
Thank you, Tony. My name is Justin Murphy. I'm the education reporter for the Democrat and Chronicle in Rochester, New York. And Rochester is an important place for Gannett. The company was first formed in Rochester in 1923 and was headquartered here until 1986. Frank Gannett was a delivery boy for the Democrat and Chronicle when he was a kid. Coincidentally, Gatehouse is also based in the Rochester area. Mike Reed lives in a big house out by the mall where I used to hang out as a kid. When I was growing up, I read the DNC as well as the Penfield Post, one of a group of Gatehouse suburban weeklies. I'd read it every week. They covered our high school sports games, graduations, local elections, stuff like that. My first ever journalism experience came in high school as an intern at the Penfield Post. All of those weeklies got shut down around the time of the Gannett-Gatehouse merger. When I got hired at the DNC in 2012, the education reporter concentrated entirely on the Rochester City School District. After a few years, they eliminated all the suburban beats, so I took on the other 18 surrounding school districts. Shortly after that, They eliminated the higher education beat, so I took on the dozen or so colleges and universities in our region, including the University of Rochester, which also happens to be the largest employer in the area. At the same time, they were cutting elsewhere, health and environment, other government beats, general assignment coverage. And so I'm technically only supposed to dedicate half my time to education and the other half to filling in gaps in our coverage elsewhere. What that means in practice, of course, is that most things go uncovered altogether. Last week, we had school board elections and school budget votes. When I began, there was a team of about 8 reporters that interviewed every candidate and paid attention to every budget proposal, and then worked late on election night, collecting the results and interviewing winners and losers to get a major results package into print for the morning. This year, it was just me. And even that was due more to my stubbornness than any editorial directive. No one ever asked me about writing a preview story of any kind. And it wasn't until Monday that an editor messaged me to ask whether I was planning to work on election night. In 2011, we had 86 Guild represented employees. Today it's 24, and that's after merging with a few other shops. A lot of those missing employees were laid off or persuaded to take early retirement packages. But what's most troubling to me are the voluntary moves some people have seen fit to make. We had a sports reporter leave to become an assistant manager at a gas station. A promising young multimedia journalist left to become an assistant field hockey coach. A number of people have left for nothing at all. They didn't have another job lined up. They just knew it was time to go. That kind of thing doesn't happen at a well-functioning company. And I want to emphasize that Mike Reed ought to know all of this, not only because he's the CEO, but because he lives in our coverage area. I assume, or at least I hope, that he subscribes to the DNC, and so its degradation affects him not only professionally, but personally as well. These problems couldn't be clearer to him. They certainly couldn't be clearer to those of us still working here. We long ago lost confidence in Mike Reed as our leader and urge you to find someone who can chart a better course for the company. And with that, I'll pass it on to Antigone.
Thank you. Greetings, I'm Antigone Barton. I'm an investigative reporter at the Palm Beach Post. In January, the Pensacola News-Journal, which is a Gannett sister paper of the Palm Beach Post, where I work, published a guest column online and in print that was a clear hit piece on me. How that happened highlights the effects of inadequate staffing, and it reflects a culture that has come to devalue both the mission of journalism and its workforce. The column that ran in the Pensacola paper falsely characterized an academic study I had written about that had linked sugarcane burning in our area to premature deaths among our county's residents. The column said the study had no data and had been produced by activists. It implied I was an activist rather than a journalist. Nothing in the column was true. The study I wrote about had been produced by scientists and was well backed by data. The column untruthfully conflated the sugarcane burning that the Palm Beach Post has covered for more than 20 years with the state wildfire control program, saying the spread of misinformation in my reporting put Floridian safety at risk. It falsely claimed that my article had run in Gannett papers across Florida. My article had not even run in the Pensacola paper that published the column rebutting it. My article had been of local interest in Palm Beach County only. The column itself had been sent to Gannett papers by a Tallahassee political PR firm. The purported author was a former state forestry director who's now a consultant who advocates for the sugar industry. The documents trail, if you looked at it, showed the PR firm president as the author. When a reader alerted me to the column in early February, I notified the Palm Beach Post leadership. I suggested that the Pensacola News-Journal publish a correction, as in addition to defaming me, it directly contradicted years of reporting on the topic with which the Post has distinguished itself, most recently with Pulitzer Prize finalist coverage the year before. But the column remained on the Pensacola News-Journal site for another week, during which its headline and the first sentence saying I had written fraudulent material remained the top Google result under my name. It was not until I mentioned that leaving the article online could make the network legally liable that it was removed. And not until I said I would speak to an attorney that a correction was issued. The article's headline was finally delinked from Google 27 days after it appeared there. In an email, the Pensacola paper's editor described to me the decision to publish a column that was submitted by a PR firm, rebutted an article she had never either read or run, that attacked a network journalist by name, and that falsely portrayed the work of respected scientists as a rush to edit. But it hadn't been edited at all. I know this because the same column was sent word for word to the Post. The true explanation for what happened is simpler. At a newspaper where the executive editor was also serving as the editorial page editor, the city editor, and the news editor over a staff that had faced 3 rounds of cuts in a single year, filling a hole in the paper on deadline had taken precedence that day over the newspaper's gatekeeper role. In the process, the facts, relevance to our readers, our credibility as a media company, along with my professional reputation, just weren't considerations. And the effect of putting out newspapers with declining resources against mounting odds compromised the most basic standard of journalism to at least not do any harm. And now I'd like to pass it on to Eliana.
Thanks, Antigone. Hello, everyone. My name is Eliana Perez. I'm a reporter at the Desert Sun in Palm Springs, California. The Desert Sun is a Gannett-owned paper in California's Coachella Valley. It's now made up of 1 producer, 3 photographers, and 14 reporters, so not nearly enough staff needed to best cover the area's 9 cities with a total population of almost 400,000 people, and home to world-renowned events like the Coachella Valley Music and Arts Festival. We're small but mighty and work hard to make do with what we have. We even work with what we don't have. Last year, Gannett decided to no longer provide company phones for its journalists, meaning we rely on our personal phones to do a lot of our core work. And at the Desert Sun, it was a 2-year battle just to get reimbursed for mileage at the IRS recommended rate of 65 cents per mile. For years, it was only 35 cents per mile, and you can imagine the difference driving so much in California. As hard as we try to provide our local community with the coverage it deserves, Gannett does not recognize our work. Typical pay for journalists at the Desert Sun falls within the upper 40,000s to lower 50,000s a year, with one of our lowest paid journalists making $38,000 a year despite nearly a decade with the company. About half of the reporters at the Desert Sun, including me, were hired or we joined in 2021 when the paper was still hiring. I speak personally and draw from conversations with some of those colleagues when I say we accepted our abysmally low pay, thinking if we proved ourselves in the newsroom, we could work our way up to a fair and livable wage, especially considering the expensive region and state where we live. More than 2 years in, we now see Gannett is not interested in fair compensation or fair anything. We could win awards as we have, we could drive up subscriptions as we have, and none of that is going to result in any improvement. There's been a pattern at the Desert Sun in which journalists work here for a couple of years and then leave for other non-Gannett news outlets. For many, 2 years has been as long as we can afford to work here. Coverage we've then lost includes our tribal affairs reporter in a state with 109 federally recognized tribes and an area with 5 sovereign indigenous territories, and our senior issues reporter who covered aging in cities like Palm Springs, where 32% of the population is age 65 or older, double the percentage seen across our county of Riverside and throughout the state of California. In the Coachella Valley, about 60% of the population identifies as Latino Hispanic, according to the most recent census. Yet I'm the only Latina reporter at the paper. While my official title is East Valley Reporter, I cover the cities of Indio and Coachella. I try to make up for the fact that our newsroom does not reflect the community we cover by taking on some Latino issue stories or stories in which I know the best sources only speak Spanish. But being the only one in the newsroom that shares a culture with so many of the Valley's residents also means I often mourn stories that simply won't get written about for lack of diverse and overall staffing. This all drove me to join the Desert Sun News Guild bargaining committee as we push to unionize, which has been an additional struggle throughout my time with Gannett. In the first year, we weren't even given enough time at the bargaining table. Gannett's lawyer would only meet with us for 1 hour at a time, about twice a month. And the company's failure to meet with us frequently led us to file an unfair labor practice charge that has been recognized by the National Labor Relations Board as a fair complaint. Other charges recognized by the NLRB include Gannett's lawyer lying to us at the bargaining table and the company ordering a vaccine attestation without consulting with the guild first. Much of what keeps a lot of us reporters and the photographers and our one producer at this Gannett company is our commitment to the community. The Valley's full of amazing stories that deserve to be shared, and we keep trying to do that. We keep trying to do our jobs, but our employer simply doesn't support us. And with that, I'm handing off to Kayla.
Thank you. My name is Kayla Dwyer. I've been at the Indianapolis Star, a Gannett newspaper, since mid-2021. For the last few months, I've covered state government and politics, and the beat I used to cover, transportation, and the beat for which I was originally hired, disappeared when I left to cover the state. The Star is far from the worst case scenario in Gannett, where much smaller communities have been dwindled down to skeletons due to 3 rounds of buyouts and layoffs in a span of 6 months last year, not to mention the cuts before. But even at one of Gannett's largest properties like us, cuts and retention issues are a big problem, and our readers notice. And I should be used to it by now. That's been the story of my entire journalism career. I started in 2017 at a Tribune publishing newspaper in Pennsylvania, which is now owned by hedge fund Alden Global Capital, and which over my 4 years there lost about half its staff through cuts and attrition and lost its physical newsroom through cost-cutting measures. And then I came to the Star, owned by Gannett. While the overall size of our newsroom has remained mostly the same over the last 2 years, the turnover has been intense. Since I arrived, I've watched about 14 people leave the Star, which is about a third of our overall newsroom, including a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and journalists of diverse backgrounds and journalists with combined decades of experience and institutional knowledge. Through the shuffling of people in coverage areas, important beats have remained unfilled: racial justice and equity, immigrant communities, and transportation. And you know why so many of those people left? It's usually money. Not the greedy kind, but rather the kind that says, I value you enough to pay you a decent wage. That means you don't just make rent, scrape by on credit cards, and leave little for savings, but that you live well enough and save up for a house and raise a family here and therefore stay here. Cost of living adjustments simply haven't happened for as long as anyone can remember, even as we navigate record inflation. Retention should be a top priority for a business built on trust between journalists and their readers. When we lose those people, we lose their networks and contacts and the trust that they've built up with sources. These are the kinds of relationships that lead to the scoops and the stories that people want to subscribe and pay for. We hear it all the time from readers and sources we talk to. They notice the changing bylines. They ask why the Star doesn't cover XYZ anymore. They believe strongly that the Star has a lot of work to do to make inroads with underrepresented communities, and we're trying to. And I understand and respect that Gannett is a for-profit company with responsibilities to its shareholders, and I get that. That business model should be built on compensating employees fairly. That should be a non-negotiable part of the budget because that's what gets you a quality product. And instead, Gannett allows its CEO to make 160 times that of his average employee. at least in 2021, and invests in anti-union lawyers to counter union drives and drag out contract negotiations across the country. The Star has been negotiating our expired contracts since the fall of 2020. You should not support a leader that thinks that this is an acceptable way to do business, particularly when that business is the Fourth Estate. And I will pass it on to Diane.
Thanks, Kayla. My name is Diane Smith. I'm a reporter at the Record Courier in Ravenna, Ohio for the past 28 years. And I'm here to tell you how Gatehouse / Gannett, we call them the big G around here, slashed our newsroom staff by 90% in less than a decade. So in 2013, we had just moved into a large new office in Kent. In addition to news, sports, photo, and editors for the Daily, we had nearly 24 editors and writers staffing our weekly papers in Summit and Portage County. Gatehouse bought us in 2017 and soon started making cuts. The new editor did a reorganization of our newsroom where beats were divided by subject matter rather than geography. So the education reporter covered all the schools. The municipal reporter, that was me, covered all the local governments. The high school sports reporter covered all the sports at 12 schools. I know I was told to concentrate on the areas with a larger population, and that prompted complaints from the communities where news never or rarely got covered. Even though we were busier than ever, we couldn't be everywhere. And I started to get the sinking feeling that we were missing stories. Maybe some big stories, and then others that weren't big, but they were important to the community. In 2018, Gatehouse also purchased the Akron Beacon Journal, which is nearby, and people began to speculate that they would shut us down and merge us with Akron. I told people, in a way, you're not going to see that, and in a way, you already are, because our bylines frequently ran in their paper and theirs in ours. Already, I was starting to see an increasing trend of filling a small paper with regional content while using less and less local news. In 2020, our office shut down because of COVID-19. Less than a year later, that building was sold. We didn't have a home base until 2022. It's a newsroom only with no circulation or advertising department. And I don't know who works in those departments anymore. When people ask who their ad rep is, we have to put them in touch with the ad director in Akron. And when they call about newspaper delivery, because customer service has been outsourced to the Philippines, we advise them to email their concerns so they have a written record of what is told to them. Also in 2020, the weekly papers that were based in Summit County were moved under the Beacon Journal. Those reporters wrote for the Beacon Journal and the weeklies, and several of them have already closed. Our staff, which totaled about 16, dropped to 9 at that time, which included editors. Since then, our managing editor has been laid off, 2 reporters have quit, and a sports writer and sports editor took buyouts. So now our staff, which once exceeded 40, has dropped to 4. We have 1 photographer who takes photos for both news and sports. We have 1 sports writer who covers all 12 school districts. We have a breaking news reporter who's also responsible for police, fire, and court coverage. And I'm responsible for everything else. If it's not crime, courts, sports, or Kent, it's my beat. Since I've been around for a long time, people know me, and I often get feedback about the paper. Most of it isn't positive. They complain about the size of the paper, the lack of local news, and the fact that they find the same stories in our paper in Akron's. Many people say that they don't know why they still subscribe, and they'll cancel their subscription when their deal is over. My biggest fear is that if any of us leave because of the low pay or the burnout, they won't replace us either. And if all of us leave, we'll go the way of the Alliance Review, the Ashland Times Gazette, and the Port Clinton News Herald. which are 3 Ohio newspapers that have no staff of their own. There will still be a paper called the Record Courier, but it won't be the same. It hasn't been, not for a long, long time. And we'll hand it over to John Schlois, who's our president.
Thanks, Diane, and thanks for the powerful testimonies, Justin, Antigone, Eliana, Kayla, and Diane. I get the honor of doing this job of representing tens of thousands of journalists across North America, and it is a true honor because journalists are fighting for truth, journalists are fighting to hold power to account, and journalists here are fighting to save Gannett. We're coming together at an unprecedented rate to do, as we say in the News Guild, whatever it takes to save local news for our communities. Just yesterday, we had a major victory by saving the old half of Gannett, the broadcasting half, from a hedge fund takeover. News Guild members and leaders used their voices to oppose a hedge fund, Standard General, in its attempt to take over Tegna, a local news broadcaster, which used to be part of Gannett just less than a decade ago, before the company was split in two in 2015. We saved thousands of journalism jobs yesterday at Tegna. And we did it because we have the ability and the strength and the collective power to take on a hedge fund boss. And we stopped them in their tracks at the FCC. We blew up a multi-billion-dollar takeover just yesterday. And now I'm here to tell you, along with everyone else on this call, that it's time for Gannett to right its ship or face the consequences. And another boss here at Gannett needs to go, and that's Mike Reed. You've read our letter. News Guild members have provided additional evidence. All stakeholders, save the top executives, have been harmed by his leadership. Shareholders, the price of the share has gone down 70% since the Gatehouse-Gannett merger in November of 2019. The workforce has been cut in half by more than half in the last 4 years since the merger. Communities have lost thousands and thousands of local news stories that could have exposed corruption in their local communities, shine a light on our world. People want those stories. They want them about their school boards. They want them about their city councils. They want them to know what's happening with their police and their neighborhoods. Gannett no longer provides our communities what they need and what they deserve. Despite the cost cutting and despite the job cuts, Mike Reed has not succeeded in growing this company. We modeled our various metrics at Gannett and found that revenues would not return to the third quarter 2022 levels until the first quarter of 2031. We can look forward to more years of decline. Digital circulation revenues will not exceed print circulation revenues until 2026 at the current growth rates. Digital circulation revenues will not exceed print circulation revenues until 2026 at the current growth rates. Digital advertising will not exceed print advertising until 2045 at the rate. Mike Reed has failed to lead Gannett into the future. Time and time again, Mike Reed tells us that journalism is important. He recently told the Boston Globe, just last month, that he fully intends to, quote, do more journalism, not less. Well, that's kind of hard to do with the ongoing job cuts, the closures of more newsrooms, and the increasing reliance on regional hubs and wire services to try to fill a void that he is creating. The numbers that the caucus for Gannett in the Guild have reported show that in the shareholder letter that are stunning when you take the number of local stories that are actively disappearing. We looked at a same day in April across several years, and as an example, the Democrat and Chronicle and had 20 stories in 2013. And then in a decade later, in this year, in April, 3 local stories, 20 to 3. 29 stories at the Palm Beach Post in 2013, down to 12 this year. 37 stories at the Austin American-Statesman in 2013, down to 9 this year. 36 stories at the Asbury Park Press in 2013, 10 years later, down to 7 stories this year. The list goes on and on. These are cuts of up to 91% of local news stories in just 10 years. If you look at every news product in the Gannett chain, you will see a decline of local news. When you cut news stories, you undermine future circulation. Why subscribe if you can't actually get the thing you're subscribing for, the local news? When I was elected as News Guild president in 2019, I spent a considerable amount of time talking to members of Congress, and I do that actively almost every single day and every single week. And we talk about the importance of local news. They understand, from a Democrat to a Republican, the value of local news and local democracy. A vibrant local press is important for so many reasons. Journalists are the watchdogs of democracy's flame. We provide multiple perspectives on social issues and economic trends and public policy. We hold power to account. But when we're weakened, political extremism surges. Corporations take advantage. Corruption explodes. Just like our victory yesterday in preventing the hedge fund takeover of a local broadcaster, we are fighting to save local news in this country, to save our very democracy. And we are actively working with political leaders to hold news companies to account and create solutions to save local news. Yet Gannett makes our work extremely difficult. Almost every single morning and every single time that I talk to a member of Congress or their staff, I think of the question, why should policymakers support Gannett when it is actively destroying local news? Gannett is spending a lot of money on stock buybacks and executive compensation, and yet not moving the needle forward. It needs to pivot right now. Renegotiate the debt, spread it out and lower the quarterly payments, reduce executive compensation, and use all available staff and cash, all the available cash to hire more journalists to produce more local news. Gannett should be the local news company that it touts that it actively wants to be. It should actually be that. And this dedication and investment into the journalists is the only way to increase circulation and boost revenue and create long-term value for all stakeholders. Mike Reed isn't the guy to do this. His track record at Gatehouse and now the new Gatehouse Gannett, or the Big G, as Diane calls it, his record is to cut jobs and destroy a company. We ask stakeholders to withhold their support for Mike Reed. Tony, back to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, everybody. This is did a wonderful job presenting some very sad stories at this news company. Now, to those in the audience, I strongly encourage you, you received a message earlier, to direct your questions into the Q&A, and we will be happy to answer them if we can. So why don't we wait a couple of minutes for such questions to appear.
Can I ask a question while people are typing out a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Antigone, can you talk about like the work that you do and the value? Like, do you love your job? Do you love actually doing your job for your community?
Very much. It is rewarding in its potential results, and it feels very important. The Palm Beach County is a place of tremendous wealth and enormous poverty. And the study that I was writing about, it took place in the Glades, the poor communities out west. But it also affected some of our wealthy residents, the sugarcane burning that happens every year. It's something that it's important to show that if you allow injustice and inequity to go unnoticed, it will affect all of us sooner or later. And that's what this study was about. And that's how you bring about change and justice, is by helping people to see their common interests. The stories that we do try to focus on that, systemic problems. This was a follow-up, the work that I was doing that prompted the attack on examining the impacts of the sugar industry on our environment, on people's health. And the sugar industry gets very, very angry whenever we do that. There are attacks, usually from outside, not from within our own newspaper. So, and that's kind of satisfying, because you realize, well, good, we are shaking things up, and we are extremely careful when we do it, because they hold us to such scrutiny. I would not want to make a tiny error that could discredit the work that we're doing. And so seeing it treated as if it was of absolutely no importance, and that this was just another side to be presented was depressing. Because yeah, I feel the work we do is important. I think it makes a difference. I think it makes our communities safer. I think that and stronger as whole communities, not just looking out for one group or another. Thank you for asking.
Actually, and I had a question too for Eliana about, I think for a number of reasons, diversity in the newsroom is important. But could you tell us a little bit about how diversity makes business sense for news outlets?
Yeah, I mean, having a diverse newsroom means that what I say, you reflect the community you cover, which means the community is more likely to be interested in the stories you're telling because it's something that involves them. It's something that is already of their interest. And you as a newsroom know that you get to, you have leads on that to even start looking in those right places, start talking to those people, And I've seen it when I branch out and write even something that's more entertainment news about a Latino artist that's here that most people in my newsroom don't know is a big deal, but I know he or she is a big deal. We get those numbers and those readers and probably that community that's not used to looking at the Desert Sun that wants to know about this entertainer that's, in town. And that's just one example. It could be bigger issues. So yeah, it's about reaching an audience that we're not reaching right now and would probably very much like to see themselves in our paper.
So that by failing on the diversity front, they're failing as well on the business front.
Right.
Yeah. Kayla, I have a question for you. You've worked for Alden Global Capital and you've worked for Mike Reed. How would you compare them?
Oh, ooh. Well, I will say it was much tougher to get at the, Alden Global Capital, of course, is a private company, and that makes their CEO much more secretive, and it is much easier for him to hide. And I do think it's a little bit, sorry, there's a train going right by my house, in case you can hear that. So in that sense, we have a little bit more capability at holding Mike Reed accountable in a public company like Gannett, just based on the sheer accessibility of information about him and the financials and things like that. As far as working conditions go, I think working under Alden, they took over at the tail end of my tenure at Tribune, but just before they did, that was the single biggest reduction in our staff when there were buyouts in anticipation of that takeover. And that whole situation really struck a lot of fear into the hearts of my coworkers, and what's going to happen to this newspaper that served this community for so long, so reliably. And I think the story at Gannett so far for me has been one more of turnover than necessarily shrinkage, but I know that that's not, the Star has been lucky in that respect in terms of the shrinkage aspect. Both have been challenging, but in slightly different and nuanced ways. But we do see similar trends in terms of constantly changing directives and advice from the top in terms of what is the way to make money and get subscribers. Is it going after clickbait, or is it going after investigative work that gets subscribers? The philosophy from the top in both companies seems to change with the seasons. That's one thing that's similar. I think I'll stop myself there.
Well, I apologize for putting you on the spot because that was a really tough question.
Quite all right.
But it is quite unique for a reporter as talented as the five of you reporters, to have worked for two employers that have done so much to destroy local news. And, with that, I think we're going to wrap up here. I wanted to, for the investors on the call, we encourage you to withhold your name from Mike Reed. I think we've made ourselves pretty clear that the paper, the 200 papers, 200 daily papers, and the multitude of weeklies and community papers, they're going in the wrong direction. And they're going in the wrong direction because of the priorities Mike Reed has set for the company. We are happy to discuss individually or collectively with any of you our concerns. We hope that you will vote accordingly at the shareholder meeting on June 5th at 8 a.m. And we wish you the best rest of the day. Thank you very much. Take care.